I don't talk about European topics very much because I am obviously a European outsider. I don't follow European news closely, I'm not keen on European culture, and since the most foreign trip I've ever taken is about 100 miles north of the Canadian border, I have no first-hand European experience. So I hesitate to be alarmist when I see news coming out of Europe, always wondering if it's an accurate representation of what's going on, or if it's cherry-picked information to make me believe things are worse than they actually are. But even if the stories are cherry-picked, even if they are isolated, a lot of the stories I see coming out of Europe fall into the category of things that should never happen, rather than things that should rarely happen. Take just this last weekend in the UK when Brittany Pettibone, Martin Sellner, and Lauren Southern were all detained by British border authorities, questioned, and denied entry for what amounts to thought crime. Now to be clear, I'm not saying the UK must let them in. They have their sovereign borders, they can enforce them in any way they like, and the rest of us can criticize that enforcement in any way we like. But consider this story in contrast to another one that broke at the same time. As many as 1,000 children are reported to have been abused by pedophiles in Telford since the 80s, but the abuse went on for decades as authorities looked the other way. And who was behind it? Oh no, not another one of those Asian grooming gangs again. Those poor Asians, they're always getting profiled. And so according to this report, the authorities let it slide for fear of being racist, which is wonderfully ironic because describing these ringleaders as Asian is itself an obfuscation with politically correct intent. It's also being reported that British border authorities don't have the same vigor to stop jihadis from re-entering their country after terrorist training trips to foreign lands like Turkey, Tunisia, and Saudi Arabia. I assume Beijing, Tokyo, and Seoul were also top destinations for these Asian combatants. Now, of course, the story isn't quite that simple. The Telford police aren't the same as the border authorities. It's not as though the people looking past the grooming gangs are the exact same people turning away right-wing speakers at the border. But these stories are part of a general theme that's developing, at least as observed from my outsider perspective. A trend of government eyes blind to horrific, violent abuse, but keenly focused on mean words and thoughts. A trend of government so fearful of being called racist, it appears to accept real, violent crime as collateral in its primary quest for inclusivity and the holy grail of diversity. The obsessive focus on thought crime at the expense of real crime was further demonstrated this week by one of the UK's most prominent politicians, London Mayor Sadiq Khan, who appeared at the South by Southwest conference in Austin, Texas, to give a keynote speech on the need for increased regulation of social media. The term Orwellian tends to be overused and cliche, but I don't know how else to describe his perspective, down to the foundational premises of his speech. If you had asked me prior to writing this video what I thought the purpose of social media is, I would have said free communication in mass, that anybody, from the lowest profile Joe to the highest profile celebrity, from the smallest mom and pop shop to the largest corporation, can share their thoughts on any topic instantly. And it's not about what those thoughts are. It's not about the content of the thoughts. It's that those thoughts can flow freely and immediately. May the dumb thoughts sink and the genius thoughts rise. But where I'm describing a process by which information flows freely, Khan's vision for social media's purpose seems more outcome-driven. That social media is fulfilling its purpose when social media serves his agenda.
Take social media. In some cases, these new platforms have been used to exacerbate, fuel, and deepen the divisions within our communities. All of this is dividing and polarizing us rather than uniting us. We must now ask ourselves, how can we ensure that technology always helps and never hinders our aim to create more open, connected, socially integrated societies? What we need to see is a stronger duty of care so that social media platforms can live up to their promises to be places that connect, unify, and democratize the sharing of information, and be places where everyone feels welcome and valued.
Well, that all sounds very nice. But at what cost? You can't have freedom and have everyone feeling valued. You have to pick one, because freedom includes the freedom to make the case that your perspective isn't valuable. Now, maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but it's that battle that is crucial to separate valuable ideas from worthless ones. It's when I challenge value and you defend it that we discover where the actual value lies. And yes, where actual worthlessness lies too. And Khan tries to demonstrate some of that worthlessness by reading some mean tweets sent to him as of late. And remember, to be a good person, you're supposed to cry during this reading. You better not laugh.
I want to share with you today just half a dozen of the types of tweets that I received. At Mem Usay tweeted, "Deport all Muslims and make London white again. All problems will be gone." At Warprever tweeted, "Sadiq Khan is just a gay Muzzy terrorist." At Emmanuel_Maris tweeted, "Muslims have no dignity. I wish Sadiq Khan would blow himself up like they all do. He might get his 12 virgins." At BillWall69 tweeted, "I say, kill the mayor of London and you will be rid of one Muslim terrorist." At Latino_Amante tweeted, "Treason is still a crime punishable by death in this country. Your name will be at the top of that list." At Speedwagon PRST tweeted, "I'd pay for someone to execute Sadiq Khan."
Ah, man, I'm kind of bummed. He didn't read mine. But I stand firmly by my words, Sadiq. You are actually a poop face. Now, to be clear, any credible threat of imminent violence should be regulated and investigated appropriately. A few of those tweets towed that line. But the trouble is, Khan bundles in what could be considered a threat with just calling him a gay Muzzy terrorist. Those aren't the same thing, and they shouldn't be regulated as the same thing. Those are just mean tweets. But Khan offers some reasons why we ought to have common sense mean tweet control.
But ask yourself this: what happens when young boys and girls from minority backgrounds see this kind of thing on their timelines? Or someone thinking about becoming a politician. There are young people who aspire to be politicians or to be in the public eye. And that sort of stuff makes them think twice. If you've got a nephew or niece or a brother or sister thinking about a career in politics or, in the public eye, would you genuinely advise them to do that, bearing in mind some of the stuff that people like me receive?
Well, point one, if you aspire to be trusted with the responsibility to try to solve the world's most complex problems, perhaps the strength to withstand a few mean tweets might be a necessary prerequisite. But to the point on children, granted, maybe mean words on the internet aren't rated G, but that should be the regulatory domain of whom? The parent or the state? You can predict Khan's answer. Maybe this is why they called Germany the fatherland, because your father and the state are really the same thing.
If this doesn't happen, then more countries will start to follow or go further than what Germany has done. The German government have changed the law so that social media companies face hefty fines if they fail to quickly remove hate speech, fake news, and illegal material.
And this is where Khan's policy prescription gets weird and confusing. In the speech, it sounds like he's praising the German policy, but in the Q&A afterward, he says he doesn't want the German policy or anything harsher.
As a former human rights lawyer, I'm a big advocate of free speech. This isn't about depriving people of free speech. This is about inciting hatred. This is about things that divide our communities. Social media companies can employ staff to proactively take these things down or to respond to complaints made. Because my worry is this: if they don't act responsibly, then we'll go down the road of Germany and even further, and you'll have people like me being pressurized by the electorate to bring in legislation, and some of this legislation may be draconian, and it may inhibit the advancements made by technology, and I think that would be a bad thing.
First, note this reasoning makes no sense in its premise. Social media must regulate themselves or face our regulation. That's a distinction without a difference. You're still telling them they must do what you say or face consequences. And the end result is functionally the same. You either erode free speech legally or you erode it culturally. And if you erode it culturally, there is no reason to suppose the legal standard won't follow. Quote Andrew Breitbart. Politics is downstream from culture. But it's that second point that's even more insidiously authoritarian. He says if social media companies don't regulate speech, the electorate will put pressure on politicians to regulate that speech. And this dilemma is exactly why speech must be protected as a right. Rights are not subject to the whims of the majority. That is tyranny of the majority. And your right to speak should exist regardless of whether the majority likes your speech or not. And if Khan's case isn't authoritarian enough, consider its scope in the context of his jurisdiction. Khan frames his case by noting the massive influence that social media companies have, and thus, in his view, the massive responsibility that goes along with it.
A handful of the largest global tech companies have managed to amass an enormous amount of power over how information is consumed.
Well, if that's true, if you're lamenting the centralization of power, why are you advocating more centralized power? Why should the global exchange of ideas be regulated by one mayor of one city? Why should the power to regulate speech content on a global scale be centralized to one guy, and a guy who isn't even a head of state, no less? Perhaps that's not what he means. Perhaps he means it ought to be regulated by some broader coalition. But even if so, we still encounter the same problem. Why should my speech rights, protected by the sovereignty of the United States Constitution, be subject to the whims of people in other countries, even a majority of them? They shouldn't. And the reality is, social media already gives you the tools to regulate your personal experience for yourself. Don't like my videos? Unsubscribe and don't watch them. Don't like my tweets? Block me. But do not claim to have authority, legal, moral, or otherwise, over the thoughts I choose to post in my corners of these networks. I will worry about my domain, and you can worry about yours, Sadiq. And speaking of mean tweets, I saw one recently that suggested there are some problems for you to work on in yours anyhow. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Okay, bye.